first thing to say is thank you very, very kindly to my colleagues today, Mike Woods from the Mid Wales Living Lab, Kerstin Hausegger-Nestelberger from the Styrian Metropolitan Area Living Lab, Carlos from the Lisbon Metro Area Living Lab, and Sabrina from the Lucca Living Lab. We have carefully selected these 4 victims to talk to you today. Thank you so much for agreeing to take part. But the selection has been really reflecting the idea that a key point in the Living Lab methodology within Robust is that it's a co-learning process between 2 parties in each of the Living Lab areas. Do you remember earlier on, Han showed us a map of the 11 Living Lab areas in the project, and so Mike and Sabrina are both academics, and Kerstin and Carlos are practitioners. They work for public bodies and are not academics. So this is why we've selected these this array of people to talk to us. So welcome all of you, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. I just wanted to say just a very few words about Living Labs. And we've taken some inspiration from the Living Lab literature, which is quite extensive when it comes to urban living labs, actually. This was mentioned this morning as well, less so for rural and rural-urban interface living labs. But living labs for us offer a very flexible method of open, by which I mean transparent experimentation, which we've applied to achieve some kind of innovation. So by open, I've said there in brackets, transparent. This is really important because the flexibility and the ability of the Living Lab to change as the experiment progresses can only really be successful if you're explaining to your stakeholders how it's changing, if you're responsive to the way that the stakeholders are informing the experimentation that you want to do. And the innovation, don't forget, that we're talking about in rural urban synergies, in Robust, is to try and produce rural urban synergies. And we've taken inspiration from a range of literatures. I'm not going to go down an academic rabbit hole today, but we've particularly drawn inspiration from Yulia Voitenko and her colleagues. And there are 5 ways that we've characterized living labs in this project. One is that they're locally embedded, and this means that they are geographically specific. I'm bearing in mind Alexia's comments earlier on that means that we mustn't be tempted to say they're also specific, that they're not generalizable. That's not the case, but they are different in each place. That reflects, of course, the idea that we covered earlier on, that 3 of the living labs take place in capital territories, 3 more take place in pretty big city regions, and others are in more provincial or rather rural locations. They're experimental in that we're having a go at changing something. We don't know the answer to start with. We change direction as we go along, but they are targeted towards real life situations. So this means that while they're an experimental laboratory scenario, we're trying to change practice as it happens. It's not sort of removed from practice. The experiment happens as practice takes place and rolls out. They're collaborative and they rely on users and beneficiaries. So this is also why they're transparent, because we need to understand clearly what the needs of the people who are going to benefit from the innovations in rural urban governance, how they stand to benefit and what they have to say about the outcomes of them. Now, one thing I just quickly want to say is that this may not be the same thing as citizens. Users and beneficiaries may not be the same thing as citizens, as they often have been in urban living labs, because we're dealing here with public authorities. So the people involved have been researchers and public officials, but also civil society organizations and commercial businesses as well. Leadership is very important in any living lab situation, but in Robust, we've tried really, really hard to be led by the needs of the practitioners, not by the research agenda. The researchers work alongside the practitioners, but it's very important for us in Robust that we've developed an agenda for experimentation that is based on the needs of the practitioners, real life needs in real time and in real places. And then lastly, the evaluation informs this iterative practice as we go along. And this is really important, not just because we need to regularly evaluate our progress, but we also hope that it will guide and adjust the way that we work and help us to share our experiences with others later. My last slide now then, and this is going back to Lilia's question earlier on, what was our methodology? We did have a standardized methodology. We have a very detailed work package guidance document that Damien led, and we shared with all the partners, and it was in 4 stages. This first stage is the envisioning stage, where we worked very closely with our practitioner partners to develop a focus for the experiments. And that was a long process, sometimes took up to 18 months in some cases. It resulted in a research and innovation agenda, which is a document that we all produced in all 11 living labs, which is a sort of living lab plan. But it's important to say that these plans and these starting points did change over time. So they weren't a blueprint or a map necessarily. They were a starting point that included objectives and indicators of success and those sorts of things, but they did change over time. Then we went into the second phase of experimenting, where we tried to do lots of background research to understand the contexts. We did consultations. We came up with ideas and tested these with different stakeholders in different formats. And then the experiencing stage was when the experiments that we devised and articulated were put into place and tested in practice, and then sometimes refined. And then lastly, the whole process was reviewed and reflected upon locally by everybody at regular intervals. But then there was a parallel work, task that Marina at Pisa University did to evaluate the whole process. So I think we do have a good idea of what we did and what worked and what was less successful. So without further ado then, let's go into the discussion. The first question is really about the idea that the living labs were experiments for innovation. So I'm going to invite our colleagues to tell us about what living lab achievements they had in mind and how these were about forging rural-urban links in their living labs. So I'll turn to Kerstin first. The other thing is, before I let you finally answer, Kerstin, is to say if anybody would like to link the living lab achievements and innovations that they made to any policy agendas that are relevant, then please do that as well. So Kerstin, what was your innovation in the Styrian region, and how did this promote rural-urban links?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Our goal was to make existing and future interactions between our urban and suburban and rural parts visible, and to enable future cooperation in order to foster sustainable regional development in our living lab. And to achieve this goal, we conducted expert interviews with 38 of 52 mayors in our living lab, and collected and published also some good practice examples about different intermunicipal projects of the living lab. And we also created a database with all intermunicipal and rural urban projects in our living lab, and created also a regional travel guide and short videos which presents the project landscape of the living lab. and all these products can be found on our website from the Regional Management Agency.
Kerstin, great. Thank you very much indeed. Let's pose the same question to Mike as well. What were your innovations and how did they promote rural-urban synergies, Mike, in Mid-Wales?
In Mid-Wales, our main focus was on producing a rural vision for Wales with recommendations and key asks for policy. And we took that focus in part because there hadn't been an integrated policy statement for rural Wales for over 20 years. And yet there are a great number of challenges and uncertainties which have already come up in the discussion over the last earlier this morning in terms of economic changes, social changes, and particularly Brexit presented both uncertainties about the future of rural Wales, but also potential opportunities for having a more integrated approach to policy. And again, further challenges in that there was a drift perhaps towards more regional policy, and there were concerns that the rural gets squeezed out. So we decided to do a rural vision for Wales. And whilst that is primarily focused on rural areas, like the long-term vision of rural areas at the European level, which Alexia talked about this morning, it addresses urban-rural connections. So the out-migration of young people in rural areas, pressures from second homes which are owned by urban residents, tourism, both the benefits and the pressure of tourism, food production, and so on. And we also, at a smaller scale, included specific actions around about the challenge of reviving the role of small towns as pivots of the rural economy and society.
Great. Mike, thank you very much. Let's move now to Sabrina, if I may. Can you tell us about your innovation approach in Lucca and how that forged rural-urban connections?
Yes, thank you, Dan. Well, as a living lab, we were actually, we've been accompanying two different processes. On one side, there was the process towards the intermunicipal food policy of the plain of Lucca, and on the other side, the territorial planning process. Both these processes had either already started or were about to start when we have initiated our living lab activities. And what the living lab has added to these processes was to keep the focus alive on these matters, to stimulate also further debate and specifically to add the rural-urban angle to these two debates and processes. But you were asking specifically about achievements. Well, here I can for sure mention the unique model of governance of the intermunicipal food policy developed in the plain of Lucca. It is comprised of two different levels. On one side, there is the participatory governance made up of several different bodies that have been designed on purpose, and on the other side there's the I would say the more administrative and policy led side of it, the joint management of food policy functions between the 5 city boards. It is quite relevant because it is the first case in Italy that the joint management of functions related to food policy, it is applied to such a broad level to 5 different municipalities. And this has actually been quite relevant in terms of breaking the rural-urban divide and to give salience to the plain of Lucca as a whole territory rather than to each municipality per se. And yes, and also it has been also useful to recognize the role of food planning or food system planning as a tool for municipalities to fulfill their functions across municipal boundaries.
Great, Sabrina, thank you very much indeed. And then last but not least, Carlos from Lisbon. Would you like to contribute now to your your Living Lab achievements and the way that your innovations fostered rural-urban links?
Okay. Hi, everyone. In our Living Lab, we adopted the central theme, a territorial economy of proximity. How we can make more close these links between the urban and the rural. Here at CCRI, I'm leading the Department of Land Planning, and what we see daily is like a division between what's rural and what's urban. How can we approach and connect these two realities? So we set in our Living Lab two big working groups. One that approach the sustainable in food schools, and the other one around the network of sustainable territorial initiatives. The group one, then it had two subgroups or small groups that had worked around the public procurement, how we can make accessible the food to the schools from the nearby, the surrounds, and respecting the public procurement. Here we have a connection with an organism from the Ministry of Agriculture, and they are working on a guide related to this. So we have here something that well, I don't know if it if it was bigger with the robust, or the robust have this link and make it more visible, this problem. But we worked with this ministry, and they are working on this guide. And the other one was something to put into the school programs related to the sustainable food. And that is already in practice in one school in Lisbon. And it's something that it was very, very nice to implement. And in the other group, we have 3 small groups, and their approach on agro-parks, how we can make a network of agri-food parks in Lisbon metropolitan area. And the other 2 were worked with valuing the ecosystem services. One trying to implement an infrastructure network and put it into the municipal plans, and the other one more linked with the business that could relate with the ecosystem services. But most of all, I think that we have more immaterial thing that happened, and I would like to emphasize this project will make some connections between dots that were actually in the field. We gave them some more scale and make it visible. And now with the policy instruments that are being prepared for this next period, some of these ideas and projects were in some institutions are using them for their new instruments. So we give them scale, we put light into these matters, and they now are priorities in our strategic instruments.
Great, Carlos, thank you very much indeed. I just wanted to draw out 1 or 2 themes that have emerged in my thinking from that quick roundup. And I'm just checking also the chats. Kerstin has put up a link on YouTube of the short videos that they developed in Styria, if anybody would like to have a look at those. But what strikes me really is that in terms of the innovations developed in these 4 areas, they've been quite ambitious, I think. You know, Carlos was just talking there about having a territorial economy approach to the work that they did. Mike talked about the idea that they implemented a rural vision because there was an absence of rural policy making in Wales for 2 decades. So these things are very ambitious that we've been trying to tackle. And Carlos was very clear there about how they've influenced local policy making. Also, Sabrina was pretty clear about how the model of governance that they put in place in Lucca was unique and helped to implement an existing foundational policy around intermunicipal food, which of course takes us again back to Styria. And I just wanted to, with no pressure, Kerstin, to invite you just to say a tiny bit more about the really exciting issue of cross-municipal management of functions in Styria. I think that was encapsulated in a legal framework, wasn't it? Is that right?
Yeah, we have a legal framework since 2018 with the law on regional development for the whole province of Styria, and also the Living Lab metropolitan area of Styria. And for example, with our interviews we did in Robust, we have the opportunity to learn more about the things, how much knowledge is there in our municipalities, in the rural parts, in the urban parts about this new structure, and also the possibilities which goes along this law. Because with this new law, we have every year the possibility to foster intercommunal projects along regional development strategy.
Great, thank you. So I hope what we've tried to reflect in that introductory roundup is that some living labs have generated a real wealth of research data to inform policy making and innovation in rural-urban synergies. Some have produced lots of practical advancements, either in developing or structuring policy agendas, or even operationalizing policy ambitions. And so, in the spirit of sharing the wealth between some others, I think with this theme in mind, Frankfurt Rhine-Main, we can mention their Living Lab did really amazing detailed research to inform the regional planning agenda there. In Tukums, we saw the development of a cultural strategy for the Living Lab, and Valencia have been really active in trying to reform the way that land use and functional planning in the entire region is reformed through the work that they did there. So everybody, thank you very much indeed for that rich roundup. In thinking about other living labs as well, as we're talking, colleagues, would you feel free to add into the chat any stories that connect to the ones that we're discussing in the panel, if you feel that you'd like to input. Okay, there's nothing more coming through in the chat. So let's move on to the second area of discussion, which is the idea of methods. You know, living labs are open experimentation and innovation procedures. They have commonly for us included a huge range of different techniques for engaging with stakeholders. And in the guidance that was developed in the project, we also drew on lots of different existing participatory methods. So again, if I might start with you again, Kerstin, if you don't mind, could you just talk a little bit about some of the methods that you used in pursuing your objectives?
Yeah, in our case, we started before the participatory methods with whole stakeholder mapping for the Living Lab together with our research partner, which was really helpful for our daily work. And based on this stakeholder mapping, based on this analysis, we implemented different regional stakeholder workshops with for example, mayors of rural and urban parts of our living lab. We also have these workshops with representatives of our interest groups, people from NGOs, and also people from our leader action groups. And in order to learn more about the cross-sectoral links, we contracted also, like mentioned before, these expert interviews with 73% of all our mayors in the Living Lab.
Can I just ask you to dwell on that a tiny bit more, Kerstin? Thanks for sharing that. I mean, I'm just thinking again about Helsinki Living Lab, where they had a rural policy network and an urban policy network, and the two of them weren't very good at talking with each other initially. So I was just wondering, how did it go for you in those regional stakeholder workshops when you're getting together people from, you know, from rural areas and maybe from such a big important city? Did they work well? Did people understand each other well?
I think the most important thing for us were really at first the stakeholder mapping, to have a good look which are our right stakeholders, I will say. And after this it works really well because we have these methods and these guidelines we got before, and so it was really working. Yeah, I can say.
Great, thank you very much. Mike, can we move to you again now to talk about the methods that you applied in your living lab?
Yes, thanks, Dan. Yeah, so we primarily held workshops as our main means of engagement, and within those workshops we employed various participatory techniques in terms of engaging people and sharing ideas. And those workshops started in person and moved online as we moved into the pandemic. And we tried to engage a wide number of people in those. So our co-partners were from local government, because our practice partner is the Welsh Local Government Association's Rural Forum. But we quite deliberately in the workshops also reached out to involve people from local action groups and leader, farm unions, other community groups and civil society organisations, as well as independent consultants and rural development workers. The emphasis in our approach was on building a consensus vision across these sectors. And I'll say perhaps a little bit more about that later in our discussion today. So that's why we were trying to co-produce, share ideas, bring together examples, reach some kind of consensus on what we thought the priorities should be, what the policy area should be. And additionally, during the pandemic itself, our practice partner, the WLGA, used its network to convene a cross-sector reference group of stakeholders to share information about what was happening in terms of the pandemic and the impacts of the lockdown, and to look ahead. And that reference group then helped to set the priorities for the rural vision as well.
Brilliant, Mike. Thank you very much. That just reminds me very quickly as well of our colleagues in Edda in the Netherlands, where the Living Lab tried to develop consensus around topics for circular farming. And if anybody wants to add to that later on when we get to the questions and answers, please do, or put something into the chat. So let's keep moving along. Sabrina, can you tell us a bit more about, I mean, you had quite a challenge, I'm sure, getting participatory methods instilled in your living lab with all the stuff on your plate. How did it work for you?
Well, considering that the core members of our living lab included on one side the province of Lucca and on the other researchers from University of Pisa and University of Florence, most of we had bilateral meetings, which were quite well attended considering how many we were. But we've also made use of the toolkit, which the Gloucestershire team provided in the Living Lab guidelines. And we use participatory methods to engage with larger numbers of different stakeholders, which included mainly representatives from public authorities, mostly regional, municipal, and provincial authorities, of course, but also from, even though to a lesser extent, private sector and the civil society. Then, as all the others, when COVID-19 hit, we had to turn online. But we had a pretty good experience with several, actually 3 online workshops, which we held during the pandemic. As we decided to split one workshop in 3, say, episodes, and we've been able in this way to address a selected common issue from 3 different angles and to involve different kinds of stakeholders. I was saying that we are actually quite satisfied with it, because the online mode has allowed us to extend the invite to a larger number of participants to what would have been in person, and has let us focus on these 3 different perspectives on the same issues.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So despite all the challenges for you, the pandemic offered a way of expanding your involvement potentially. Great, thank you very much. Carlos, would you like to add?
Yeah, well, in Lisbon at the beginning, we started with workshops when we were in the phase of building the vision and structuring the work. There were big workshops, and that was the first stage. Then, when we set the structure of the work by working groups, then the meetings in each group, it was led by the stakeholder that was responsible for each group, and the work in each group was held by the stakeholders and the lead partner. The stakeholders basically were municipalities, public authorities, schools, producers associations, entrepreneurs, also the big supply market in Lisbon metropolitan area. So it was a big, diverse group of stakeholders. With the COVID at the beginning, it was not easy to handle with the new reality, but after a few weeks, the dynamic, it was already very, very big, and we were almost we're almost killed by the dynamics, and the network in the groups grew much easier because it was easy for the people to be in those meetings and to participate. So I think that with this COVID thing, we lose some things, the face-to-face meetings, but the networks were bigger and easier to work.
Right, thank you very much indeed. I think what Carlos, you've raised for me here is that because you were involved in the food markets, you needed to connect to market-based mechanisms in food supply, and that reminds me again of some other Living Lab experiences. Public procurement was a focus of 5 different Living Labs, including Ljubljana and Lucca and Valencia, Lisbon, Gloucestershire, and the 5th one I have made a note of now, but I can't remember. Where was it? No, that's it. Oh, Ljubljana, excuse me, Ljubljana. You did a lot of work on public procurement. So that was a way to get involved with market actors, I think, because we're talking about innovations in buying food. I just wanted to add as well very quickly that in Gloucestershire, where we were also involved with public procurement, but also ecosystem service work, we met with our colleagues in Mid Wales, who are next door to us, to discuss new innovations in public procurement food markets called dynamic procurement systems. We also used a technique called appreciative inquiry in a workshop to try and get private sector industry actors, civil society and food industry to try and come to a consensus around issues on sustainable diets in the public sector. And I just wanted to ask all of our panelists very, very briefly, I've got my eye on the clock a little bit here, but and this could then shift us slowly into the next conversation, which is about challenges. But did you feel, you four, did you feel any particular absences in your discussions, for example, with private sector actors? They did come up as people who were less involved, which maybe we shouldn't be surprised about, because we're thinking about governance structures, but in some cases the governance structures would have been contracts, would have been supply chain operations. Did you find, colleagues, that private sector actors were harder or not so hard to get involved beyond public procurement?
Maybe I can start, and I can mention then in our case it was harder because as regional management we are used to work with our mayors and with NGOs, for example, but yeah, it's not common to work with this kind of stakeholders, but in our situation, the stakeholder mapping was useful to find some first stakeholders or new stakeholders. Yeah, we also
Great.
include in our workshops.
Great, thanks, Kerstin.
If I can come in, Dan, and I think, yes, I think private sector participants are a absence, but I don't think that's a particular challenge of robust or the living labbing approach. I think it is difficult to engage private sector actors because time is money for them.
Yes.
And that's the same issue. I mean, I was involved in a conversation about this with regard to leader evaluations recently. Leader projects are often challenged about having substantive contributions from private sector partners. And I think it's understandable. And I think sometimes we are, in our eagerness to be inclusive and the encouragement to engage with the private sector, we actually don't see things from their perspective and understand actually what their priorities are, and actually they haven't got time to spend lots of time involved in these kind of projects. So we didn't have a great deal of direct private sector engagement. What we were able to do, though, was engage with the Federation of Small Businesses in Wales, so a representative sector. And they participate in activities, and we had bilateral meetings with them, and they've actually picked up some of the elements of what came out of Rural Vision in some of their work.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Mike. That's valuable. Sabrina, Carlos, anything you want to add? Don't feel you have to.
If I can move in, yes, as I anticipated earlier, we had to a lesser extent participants from the private sector, but as Mike was mentioning earlier, the Living Lab has been working based on informal relations and voluntary participation, and for the private sector is hard to engage when there is no specific and explicit commitment to work on a project like this.
Sure.
So,
great. So thanks very much for that, Sabrina. Let me just quickly come in. I'm not dwelling on the business sector because they were absent. We work with farmers a lot, we work with suppliers a lot, as we've been saying, but I think I'm drawing this out partly because the governance arrangements that we were dealing with were sometimes handled in the private sector, such as supply chain contracts. It wasn't all about making public sector policies. This is the point of shifting into this arena. And before I move on, Carlos, if you would like to have the last word on private sector engagement, is up.
When we started this the project at the beginning, we were able to have some private sector, and some of them big ones in our workshops. But with the working groups evolved, there was less private sector representatives. There were, well, we have some people linked with the agriculture association. We have that kind of representation, but mainly it were public sector. We also have some entrepreneurs, but like linked very much to the social, something small entrepreneurs we have in a few working groups, but the big ones, we had them in the beginning to set the focus of the living lab, but then the public sector leads mostly the groups.
Great, Carlos, thank you very much indeed. Just before we leave the private sector behind us, I was going to also make one comment about sort of moving beyond regional thinking. You know, we've been talking a lot so far about our regions and how we've been working within the regions. Two living labs particularly seem to me to be very, well, at least two, actually three. EDA, which is involved in the Food Valley initiative, which positions the area as a global innovation center in agri-food innovation. That gives us a global reach to rural-urban connections in the Living Lab there. In a different arena in Frankfurt, which is of course an enormously important global financial center, some of the really exciting work that happened there was around commuting compared to home working and its impact on road safety and CO2 emissions, for example. And then in Helsinki, not only is Helsinki the capital city of Finland, but they have very close ties, both geographically and in terms of enterprise, with another capital city across the water, Tallinn. So some really interesting work came out of the Helsinki Living Lab, which was looking at foreign direct investment in Estonian companies, as well as looking at labor mobility between the two cities, as well as things like mobility between high-tech companies in the growth region. So we've got actually you know, quite a lot of engagement one way or another, either through operationalization of innovative supply chains or through research to inform smart growth and those sorts of things going on in our living labs in many, many ways. So thank you very much indeed, colleagues, for those contributions. Okay, so I'm doing well on time. I'm 3 or 4 minutes ahead of myself, which is not a bad thing, I'm sure. But let's, yes?
May I interrupt? We have a question from Sebastian.
Oh, great. Yes,
and
please.
He asks if there have been, or actually we're a pretty small group. Sebastian, do you want to unmic yourself and ask your question to the labs?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
So I was curious, well, first of all, thanks for all the nice contributions. Since I'm not part of the Robust Consortium, it's really interesting what you've done. I think I have a question regarding incentives for stakeholders or involving stakeholders. You've managed to bring in lots of different people to your projects, less so much for private sector actors, but nevertheless. My question is, did you have explicit incentives for those actors to participate in your projects? Have they been budgeted into your project, or have there been other incentives? Thanks.
Thanks very much for that question, Sebastian. It's a very good one, and let's open it to our panelists in a second. Maybe I'll quickly start by clarifying that as far as I know, no stakeholders were incentivized from the robust budget. The two participants, you know, the researchers on the one hand and the practitioners on the other, they were budgeted for within the project. But as far as I know, and anyone else can argue against this if I'm wrong, we're incentivized sort of financially, maybe some sandwiches here or there, that sort of thing. One thing I would just say, maybe from our own living lab in Gloucestershire in southwest England, one of the things that we perhaps can share is that we were all involved in three themes you may remember. And in Gloucestershire, we worried about ecosystem services, sustainable food, and also business models and labor markets. And these three themes played out differently. And I think it's pertinent to mention this in response to your question, Sebastian, because we did quite good work in ecosystem services because we worked with a network that wanted to implement the experiment that we pursued. We came together with people and said, you know, we know what's going on in flood risk management in this region. We know that it's difficult. We'd like to set up an experimental competency group of experts who were flood risk managers from local authorities to discuss these things. And we're going to take this forward slowly over a couple of years. And we ended up with a very good new governance model for flood risk management using nature-based solutions in the entire region, not just in our county. Similarly for food, we had the benefit of a government-sponsored pilot project to localize food procurement in the southwest of England region. So it was again advantageous timing for us because we were able to work with our colleagues at the county council to think about rewording their food procurement contract in a way that would help suppliers engage with this pilot. And then lastly, when it came to business models and labor markets, we were really interested in how the circular economy could be introduced in policy making in the county. And that was less successful, partly because it's a really big and complicated arena of thinking at the moment that's just emerging, but also because the policy hook wasn't quite there. We didn't have a clear policy agenda other than through an industrial strategy that was then kind of made obsolete through the central government policy prioritization. So what I'm trying to say to you, Sebastian, is that it was not hard to incentivize stakeholders to engage in our county because we try to do things that people really wanted to see happen. And in that respect, the Living Lab expanded capacity, set up new fora of voices to discuss and to test ideas. And I think it did result in practical change. So there, I've taken up far too much time. What about my colleagues on the panel? How did you incentivize your stakeholders to get involved?
I think in our case, in the metropolitan area of Styria, it was really helpful that most of our stakeholders know the regional management as institution. And I think this was one of the, was a helpful point that they know us, they can hopefully trust us. And so, they also like to come to our workshops and to the other robust events.
So you were clear, weren't you, in your Living Lab reporting that you sort of acted as a rather valued facilitator and as a politically neutral agency. So you already had some sort of capital in the bank in that respect.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And I think this was really helpful. I think it will be hard when you start as a complete new team in the Living Lab working on complex topics.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Let's move along the line. Mike, did you have a contribution about incentivization?
Yes, and I think, we didn't financially incentivize participation. The incentive was feeding into the discussions we had about this was about shaping the vision and informing policy. So there was an incentive for some of the groups to be involved in that. The one exception perhaps is that we, out of the themes identified in that work, we've done a follow-up survey of young people, and we have as that entered people, individuals who completed that survey have gone into the draw for a prize. There's a slight incentive there. But I think one thing I think is important to note, and this partly I think also addresses a question Alexa has put into the chat about the difference between engaging urban and rural stakeholders, is that in a region like ours, that time commitment and the cost of being involved substantially involves travel. So it can take 2 hours or more to travel each way from one side of the region to a single meeting. So when we're having physical workshops, the cost of being involved wasn't just the 2 hours in the workshop, it's also potentially 4 or 5 hours traveling that day. And one, in a sense, benefit we saw of having to switch online in the pandemic is that when we ran the final workshop online, we got a much larger participation and a wider range of participants in that, partly because it was more accessible by being online, although there were still some key stakeholders who, again, we found it easier to do bilateral meetings with in order to fit their schedules.
That's a really important and fascinating point, Mike, I think, because if you think back to some of the things that Damien was saying earlier on about the foundational economy, and Alexia was saying about the rural vision, you know, this idea of connectivity being an essential service to ensure that there's better integration in regional development, in rural-urban interdependencies, all those sorts of things. You've expressed that, you know, even more immediately in terms of being able to have a voice in the development of your very important rural vision. So thank you very much indeed. Okay, how about Sabrina? How did you incentivize your stakeholders in Lucca?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, nothing more than their interest, than their own direct interest was the incentive for them to participate. And also because, as I said earlier, we've been accompanying to already built, to already existing processes. So these stakeholders had already been activated. Our role was more to keep the focus on these two processes and to stimulate the debate further rather than providing incentives to participate.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. And Carlos, how about you? Would you like to say anything about incentivizing stakeholders, or is it a similar story to Sabrina?
Yeah, no money, just cookies, and how we could have their interest in things that could. The basic is what, in the end of the day, what do I gain with this to participate in this workshops, in this project? So that was the focus and the challenging to create a motto that was sufficient interest yeah, for most of them.
Great, thanks. I mean, I just want to go back as well to something that I skipped over very quickly in the introduction. In that first phase, the envisioning phase, we spent a great deal of time between us co-developing and agreeing and articulating these research and innovation agendas. So, you know, a lot of work, I think, was put into really getting to grips with the priorities in those themes that we all selected, in making sure that we had a good knowledge at the technical and the policy level in our practice partners, and that we identified, you know, Kerstin said this a number of times, through things like stakeholder mappings, which we also did in Gloucestershire, who the key players were. In some cases, I think, you know, I'm thinking now of Frankfurt and the rather rigid legal structure within which they had to operate in informing the regional plan. And, you know, if Rolf or Reinhard, you'd like to contribute at this stage, please feel very, very free to say so. But in some cases, there was a rather formal structure within which people had to operate, rather than having a rather open one, as some of us have been describing. And maybe Styria's was a little bit more, you know, of a halfway house between something very rigid and something very open with an unknown starting point, perhaps. So I would just really emphasize that the research and innovation agendas were co-produced with practice partners on the basis of long discussions and around some agreement of shared need, and then going on to identify who the key beneficiaries and stakeholders are. Okay, so I've just got my eye on the questions, and people are saying things like, what about the legacy? And I will come back to that, because it is a question that we have on our list. You know, people are saying you've done all this great work, but now your project's going to end. Then what? You know, does all this just go up in smoke? And the answer to that is, you know, possibly, but in some cases, absolutely not. But let's come back to those, if I may. Sebastian and Alexia, you presented those questions. So I'll rely on Han or Alison to really make sure that we address that question at the end. Okay, so Alexia, I've got your latest question there. Good. We'll come back to that. But let's just keep going. We've got a couple of quick ones that are pertinent, I think, to this. We could even no, let's do them one at a time. Let's keep it simple. So the third question is to think, but you know, we talked a lot about really good things. We've had success. We've done very innovative things. We've been really ambitious. We've developed policy. We've implemented policy. We've brought people together. We're great. We can do it. But it wasn't really all that easy, was it? And this morning, Han talked about how, you know, we've been actually from the start to the point that we're at now, from the start of developing the proposal to the point that we got to now, we've been doing more or less six or more years of work. And in some cases, you might even say, well, are these innovations actually that amazing? I'm thinking, for example, about how we've worked with our really wonderful colleagues at Gloucestershire County Council on food, and what's our achievement been? About 3 lines of wording in a commercial contract for tendering. Well, you know, is that really an enormous achievement? Well, it is, of course, but this leads us into the idea that there were many challenges. And so I'd like to invite our colleagues. Let's mix up the order now. Maybe let's start with you, Carlos, if I may. What challenges did you find in developing your living lab? You know, of course, we're in a public forum here, so, you know, we've got to be diplomatic and not insult our colleagues or, you know, say things that are in our in the shadows of our minds, but there are important lessons to learn. So could you talk about some complexities, some challenges, some difficulties that you faced in Lisbon in the period of time that we've covered?
I think that the first and the big challenge was to have an idea, a concept for our living lab. What was how we could address this rural-urban linkages? How could we work with this? Our living lab, it was at it was at 0 point. We didn't have anything, any example, nothing. So it was built from the beginning of this project. It was very interesting. Sometimes it was well, are we getting somewhere? That question arises our heads. But with putting that difficulties away, I think it was a challenge, difficult path, but now that we are where we are, I think it was a good experience. The COVID at the beginning, we thought, well, now how we were going to work. It was between that and the envisioning phase, I think that the COVID was a piece of cake. And then there's the matter of the leadership of the living lab and the working groups. It's quite time consuming, and sometimes people that are leading the working groups, they have their own lives, they have their own jobs, and they just get cookies for being in this meeting. And when we are in Zoom or Teams, well, they have to get their own cookies. So it was a difficult project, but it's rewarding at this phase. And I think that for CCDR it was something that gave us a new strength as a partner within the region, and we can be a facilitator, a promoter. So it was very rewarding, but at the beginning it was a very difficult times.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Carlos. How about Mike? Would you like to go next?
Yes, thanks, Dan. I think one of our biggest challenges has been mentioned several times already, which is time.
Yeah.
And it certainly took us quite a bit of time to work out what it was we wanted to do, and then even more time to scope that and to talk to various people and get it set up and so on. An added level of complexity for us was that our practice partner, the WLJ, is a representative organisation. We were working with the 9 local authorities, which are predominantly rural local authorities in Wales. And that had great advantages in that it gave us lots of different access to different people. We were working with an organisation which was strategic and thinking about engaging with governments and so on. But it didn't have the capacity to undertake practical projects itself. That wasn't what it did. So when we're looking at more practical projects, we tried going into some of the individual councils, and that took time to build those up and create the right connections. And some of us worked and some of us didn't, and some of that got derailed by the pandemic. So the main focus with the rural vision is much more strategic. And as a vision, you could potentially argue that we never got beyond the envisioning stage of the Living Lab methodology because we were just talking about visions all the time.
Sure.
So time is an issue there. And then the other challenge I'll briefly mention is that with an emphasis on co-production and consensus building, that at times meant that we had to scale back some of the radical ideas which are being put to us or floated to us, or to try to navigate around some of the more contentious and controversial ideas.
Can you give us an example of one?
Yes.
Maybe?
So, for example, I mean, the idea of rewilding is very controversial in Wales at the moment. And that's a critical issue in many ways to land management in the future, the place of farming. We're talking about a vision for 10 years' time, and lots of people be advocating visions in which significant portions of land will be given back to more extensive land uses to forms of rewilding. But that's a highly contentious issue, and it wasn't one we're going to get consensus from the various groups we had around the table on. So we ended up leaving that out of our vision statement because it couldn't build consensus.
Yeah.
Similarly, we ended up putting in the statement a number of different options for governance models because we couldn't get consensus behind one particular model. So we had a range of different ideas and said, there needs to be further discussion about which of these would be most appropriate.
Great. Thank you so much indeed. I mean, if I might just quickly interject there, that I think that's really important about how the practice partner, the Welsh Local Government Association, as a representative organisation, didn't have capacity to undertake practical projects. That's a very important point, I think. Also, the idea of consensus and contention is important, Mike, and reminds me of another living lab. I'm putting words into your mouth here, colleagues from Tukums, so you can correct me in the chat or live if you like, but you did interesting work around the development of a cultural strategy. And my recollection of that was that rather like Mike's experience, there was contention, but around the role of tourism as a rural opportunity, or possibly as a detrimental impact on the quality of rural life. And also I seem to recall that there was some ideas around consolidating the organization of cultural houses, cultural institutions in rural areas, when actually there was a lot of independence in between those institutions, and collective working wasn't something that was universally supported, even though it might have been efficient. So let's let that hang there and see if any Tukum's colleagues say, no, you've got that all wrong, Dan. And meanwhile, let's move to Kerstin. Could you reflect upon your challenges?
Yeah, when I'm thinking about the methods, we had the goal to do these interviews, like I mentioned before, with all our mayors. And in our living lab, we have municipalities with, for example, 600 inhabitants, but also the second largest city of Austria, the city of Graz, with approximately 280,000 inhabitants. And so it was quite a challenge to include all these mayors in our qualitative survey. And in the end, we managed to do 38 from 52 interviews, but it was much more time consuming than we thought at first in our team. And also when I'm thinking about us, the research partner and the practice partner, the COVID situation was at first a challenge for us as a team, because we were used to work together in regular personal meetings. So it was quite a new situation to do all the stuff online. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Let's move to Sabrina for the final contribution on challenges.
Yes, well, essentially what we had to do was to strike a balance between different competencies, between different working styles, values, and even ambitions in our team. And so it took a little bit of time to find a common language between the same members, the very members of the Living Lab. But here I would like to reconnect to what I said earlier. We had several bilateral meetings and we needed quite some time to converge on a common focus. And in this regard also, the project's timing was somehow a constraint, because as I anticipated, our Living Lab had a double core, and we eventually find a common theme, a bridging theme, which was the enhancement of abandoned and used peri-urban land. So we felt like it took us quite a long time to find a common focus, and then the project time was up. So if I were to say which of the phases of the Living Lab I would like to have extended, I would ask for a longer experimenting phase, as we thought, we found that quite crucial for our case.
Great, that's really a valuable contribution. Thank you very much indeed. And while I'm here, I'll just sort of acknowledge that there's a lot going on in the chat, so do have a look there. Mike's added some stuff about how tourism was also controversial in mid-Wales. Have a look there. Hilke from Helsinki has also suggested that you know, their objectives of developing tools and practices to facilitate cooperation were not necessarily taken forwards in the way that they had anticipated. So, you know, this is a common reflection around time, ambition, objectives across the piece. One thing I'll share as well from Gloucestershire, seeing as you raised it, Sabrina, is language, only simply in the way that, you know, sometimes we need to check our language as researchers when working with our colleagues in the county council, because, you know, we all talk a particular and rather inaccessible language often, I feel, in academia, and we needed to keep that in check. Okay, Rolf has said as well that people expect results at an early stage. They want to see a perspective of evidence of better policy. It's not enough to generally discuss rough ideas. That was the experience in Frankfurt. Really, really important point, Rolf. Thank you very much for contributing that. Let's keep moving on. I've got my eye on the time. We've got about 10 minutes left. So let's, if we can just do this in 2 minutes each, I'd be grateful. And that gives us a tiny bit of time at the end to think about this question of legacy. So 2 minutes each, and Sabrina, let's start immediately with you. If you were to give any advice or any encouragement to other people who are thinking about doing a living lab, particularly around urban rural, of course, what would it be? What advice would you give to others who were going to think about doing this?
Well, I would start from building a shared vision since the very beginning, which is crucial. And in relation to both the living lab internal collaboration and in relation to desired outcomes, because we might have been too focused on content and we kind of lost the internal relationship. And connected to the second point, I would suggest that a clear assignment of roles and tasks is actually something that might be very valuable in terms of suggestions for future partnerships of this kind.
Great, that's very clear. Thank you so much for that. Kerstin, would you like to go next? What advice would you share?
Yeah, the coordination of different regional actors and interest groups take time, and therefore, in my view, a clear goal for the whole living lab must be defined in a first step, and in which the added value of the work in the living lab became visible for the whole living lab. Because in my view, the most important thing is that in every stage of the process, it's so important that everyone and all stakeholders know what is the added value for the living lab. And my second advice is that I think it's also important that there's that there is a strong main team for the whole living lab to do this knowledge transfer to all the stakeholders in the living lab.
That's brilliant. Another fantastic contribution, and I think goes back to some of the questions that Sebastian was asking about incentivization. So transparency is important, understanding added value is important, and I think, you know, what we've also been hearing from both Sabrina and Kerstin just now is this idea that you need to have a very good focus. But then we've got this this other characteristic of living labs, that the focus maybe changes depending on what's coming out in practice. So we've got to be focused but flexible and sharing that all the way along with our stakeholders to make sure that they stay engaged. Okay, Carlos, over to you, please. What about your advice?
Well, it's not, there's not very big difference what they said, but I think the early involvement of the stakeholders is it's a key question. The leading of the work involving research partners and practice partners, so very linked in the leading of the process, and this flexibility, but you have to be realistic about the aims and timescales so that we aren't shooting to the moon and just fall in the country just nearby. So we have to be very focused, and I think you've mentioned something a while ago. It's the language that we use, because we are doing this document about ecosystem services, and we have to cut all those academic talk, because this is going to be used by people in the real world. So how we communicate, are we talking the same things or different things? Yeah. So this language thing, it's a very important one.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I'm glad you raised that, because Reinhard has just mentioned in the chat that not only do scientists talk nonsense, but so do administrative professionals. Lots of legal language there, he's saying. And also to add to that, that legal language is country specific. So for transnational cooperation, you've got an added challenge, and English, of course, is the way that we've tended to communicate within the project, which is lovely for us, but another challenge around meaning and concepts being different perhaps from those on the continent. So Rainer, thank you so much for adding that in. Fits perfectly with what Carlos was saying. Mike, last but not least, any advice you'd like to share?
A lot of it reiterating what others have said, to have a strong core team, meeting regularly, working together regularly. That's what made this project very rewarding in terms of working closer to our practice partners, but perhaps also think about how we more securely, more firmly include wider stakeholders as well. Is perhaps something I'd take away for the future. And then as part of that, recognizing each other's interests and limitations, being realistic about aims and timescales, but also I think being alert to political context. And I think,
good point.
Again, I think in terms of this cross-sector collaboration, again, I think practice partners, particularly those who are in government, who are policy oriented, have all kinds of political constraints on what they can do, which actually are not things we are used to thinking about as researchers.
I think that's a great point, Mike. I think we saw that in EDA, where the opportunity to think about the Environmental and Planning Act was delayed centrally and caused problems for the municipality there. Ljubljana, we saw really great objectives to try and follow what had happened in the city council in the region. That was not quite so straightforward. So thank you very much indeed for that. Ilona from Ljubljana has said very much so with regard to land management and civil law in general. That's in response to this idea of legal complications. We're about to go into the last question. You've got about half a minute each. I just wanted to quickly highlight Talis from Tukums talking in the chat there a little bit about some of the challenges around digitization and an increasingly mobile and open society and what that means for preserving local culture. That's a very, very important issue, and also links back to what some of the themes that Alexia was covering. So in 30 seconds each, what are you going to do about your legacy? Let's start with Carlos. You've got those wonderful working groups run by volunteers who are fed by cookies. Is this all going to collapse after the project finishes?
I hope not. Well, some of the work is already ongoing. This, like I said, this program, this project that was made with school, at least that is, and Isabel have a very close link with the municipality and the school, so that project is ongoing. We have other two related to the agro parks and the green infrastructure that we are trying to have this new funding period. And I think that we have there something that they could live beyond this robust project.
Great, that's good. Thank you very much indeed. Kerstin, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in Styria we have the new law on planning and development since the year 2018. And the goal of the law is to foster the intercommunal and rural-urban cooperation through this mentioned annual regional budget that finance the intercommunal projects. And therefore, we will also have the opportunity in the future to respond to the needs that have become visible through Robust.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Sabrina?
Yes, we are drafting guidelines for directed to local planners for the enhancement of peri-urban land, which are based on the Living Lab process, and they serve the purpose of informing the territorial planning process, which is ongoing at the province level. And targeted planners and policymakers are under no obligation, of course, to follow these guidelines, but we wish to count on a certain degree of visibility that Robust might have gained in the past years. And also, besides this, we are trying to make attempts to keep peri-urban land abandonment in the food policy agenda as a sort of additional robust legacy, which we also wish to value, for instance, in as a matter to address in other local projects or in new proposals. Why not?
Great. So that's an expansion of the food policy focus. That's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. And last then, but not least, Mike, over to you. Legacy considerations.
Yes, thanks, Dan. Yes, so I mean, we're working on a vision statement. It's quite explicitly aims to have a legacy into the employment of time, but it's also dependent, or largely dependent, on others implementing the proposals in it, particularly government. So we spent much of the last 6 months focusing on promotion. We've been speaking to ministers, to civil servants, to try to get ideas adopted as part of the policy process, but also feed into wider public discussion. So one of the concrete things we've done is we commissioned a series of podcasts, which we have being presented by former First Minister of Wales. And we've got a series of podcasts on each of the rural vision themes. And that's actually been also a good way of engaging more stakeholders, because we've stepped back as researchers. I've been involved in only one. We've had our local authority colleagues speaking on and representing the project in those, but also 2 other stakeholders in each of the themes. And that's helped to engage a wider group in discussions about how to take these ideas further.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Mike. And just to say there on those sorts of resources, of course, there have been a huge array of resources produced within the Living Labs, within the themed communities of practices, and by the ICLEI team, which are online to help people learn from our experiences. So let me just thank my colleagues, Kerstin, Sabrina, Mike, Carlos, thank you very, very much indeed for engaging in this panel. Thank you to my other Living Lab colleagues, and I'm sorry if I've misrepresented you, any of you. The time is not enough. Let's go to questions. Alison, would you like to raise these?
Thank you, Taskmaster Dan. No, I think we had a very lovely, lively discussion during this time. If anyone has anything that they would like to add or contribute at this time, please just either raise your hand, put it in the chat. Otherwise, then I would say that we will just gently conclude this session and move on to the last little bit of today's agenda. Does anyone have any other questions? Do we make sure that we got all of them? I think, Dan, you did a brilliant job weaving them in the entire time, but I want to make sure that we haven't lost any.
Lily has put one in just towards the end there. Did some of the Living Labs bring to sign action plans? I don't know if you want to expand on that question, Lilia.
Yes, I could explain, because I think that it's different to produce guidelines, recommendations, from engaging the stakeholders in signing, so committing, being committed to implement together things is a quite different outcome. So I asked whether, because I listened that there were recommendations.
So I mean, sorry.
Yeah, just engaging stakeholders in signing joint action plan for implementation.
I mean, one example, or maybe, you know, two I'll very quickly reiterate from Gloucestershire, was that the county council has now got a contract that it will issue to suppliers of school meals that includes a requirement to hook the whole school food procurement program up to the dynamic procurement system, which is a really great tech innovation that will help localize procurement. So it's not an action plan, but it's a wording in a legal contract that will compel commercial suppliers to act in a particular way. So that's maybe an equivalent. And the other one is that, and another legacy consideration, is that when we're talking in our region around flood risk management, we've set up an entirely new governance structure for integrating nature-based solutions in flood risk management, which is a standalone subgroup of an existing network. So that will continue and will be governed by that network. It has a terms of reference, it has a work program, and it even has a budget. So these are things that were stimulated through the Living Lab and will survive and be operationalized through networks that are independent of the Living Lab. So I hope that goes some way to answer your question.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, so if there aren't any more, I would say thank you very much, Dan. This was very, very interesting and enlightening. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thanks you for the extra contributions from the other Living Lab members in the audience.